Thought I'd do a video on manual transmissions. We're in a Jeep that has a little bit of history. Now you will notice that the check engine light is on and our electronic throttle control light is on. This vehicle is actually a Hemi. It's not an LS or an LT. This woman came to us many years ago and wanted a manual transmission LS swap, and she wanted over 400 horsepower. At the time, there really weren't a lot of good options for manual transmissions, and yes, we were doing them. We were doing the NSG 370s, and as you know, we're doing the Tremec 6060 now. I've had customers do the AX15. We've done the MVG 4500s. So we're going to talk about manual transmissions today, and we'll talk a little bit about this Jeep. So I guess the first question you have to ask yourself, is it worth going to a manual transmission? And the answer just depends. In today's world of modern automatics, it really doesn't make any sense as far as performance goes. Now, there are guys that have special needs. There's a couple of situations where the manual transmission may outperform the automatic. But what you have to consider is back in the early days, and I'm talking 70s and even 80s, the manual transmissions were more efficient than the automatics. They had less friction, they created less heat. But the transmissions we had were 3 speeds and 4 speeds. I remember when the Turbo 700 came out with an overdrive, and overdrives went way back, but the reality was they were pretty inefficient transmissions and they put a lot of heat out. So if you were to go, for example, and buy a Mustang or a Camaro in the 80s, you would see that the mileage and the performance was better than the automatic counterpart. That's not so true today. When you look at the 6L80, GM pretty much rated it at the same miles per gallon and sometimes better performance than the manual. And there's reasons for the automatic having better performance. If you look at the 8-speed, which stepped that up, and now the 10-speed, it would be very difficult for you to get a manually shifted vehicle to perform with its automatic counterpart. For one, you have something called torque multiplication. Torque multiplication basically means that the torque converter slips. So when you come to a stop, the engine can continue to idle even though you're not pushing in a clutch. Essentially, the fluid in the torque converter takes that up. Now, there's inefficiencies in a torque converter slipping. It's called torque converter slippage. So then manufacturers started to come out with lockup converters. And the early lockup converters were just that. They were either locked up or they weren't. I remember back in the 80s when I would do engine conversions, I'd put a switch on the dash so the customer could lock up their converter. Things are a lot more sophisticated now. We have pulse width modulated converters, which basically mean that they can lock up to any level that they want. So if one gear is too low and the next gear is too high, the torque converter can actually make that up by having a little bit of slippage. So torque multiplication is your friend when it comes to acceleration. A lot of you guys power brake to launch. You put your foot in the brake, you rev the motor up, and then you let the brake off and you launch harder than if you hadn't done that. That was a great little trick. You can't do that so much today because most vehicles have what they call brake pedal position sensors, and they know you're on the brake and they won't let you rev the motor up. A lot of guys install something called a line lock, and that basically locks your brakes up by pushing a button so you can load the engine against the drivetrain. Then when you release the line lock, it essentially does the same thing as holding the brake, and therefore you have all that energy stored and you launch harder. Now, I drove manual transmissions for most of my early driving career, and I really liked driving them, mostly 4-speed Muncies, Borg Warners, etc. Unless you can really operate a manual transmission like a master, you're not going to be able to launch like these modern automatics. Some of these operating systems have launch control built in, and they just launch hard. One of the other problems with launching a manual transmission hard is it really thrashes the drivetrain. When you dump the clutch, you're essentially putting all that shock into the drivetrain, where a torque converter tends to dampen that. I remember back in the 70s when the Porsche turbos were being tested, guys could get sub 6-second 0 to 60 times, but they'd almost always trash the clutch because they had to dump it. So they tested them with a rolling start. So these are the things that the automatic doesn't have to deal with. Some of the other benefits of the automatic are essentially your hands off. Now, we all know that you have to use a hands-free device for making phone calls, etc. in your car. With the manual transmission, you're always slave to that shift lever. If you're in traffic like I am now, I have to shift this transmission. And I can tell you that back in Los Angeles, driving a manual transmission was fun for about a half an hour. But then when I got into LA traffic and crawled, sometimes for hours, it really became a burden, where an automatic is a much better option in that situation. Off-road, the modern automatics are awesome. The modern automatics, having the torque multiplication and high diversity of gearing, and that's something we'll talk about in a second, means you can just basically throw it into drive and go. With an LT or an LS, 6-speed, 8-speed, 10-speed, you can pretty much put it in 4-high and just go. Even some of the steepest hills you can climb in 4-high with no problem, because you have a really low first gear. The 6L80 has a 4-to-1 first gear, and the 8L90's got a 4.6 first gear. If you compare that to the Chrysler 4 and 5 speeds at around 3-to-1, that's a huge step up in low gearing. So having this low gearing, having the torque of a V8, having torque multiplication, basically means you can get on the trail and just cruise. I've had trail bosses tell me it's almost like cheating. If you were in a manual transmission, you'd have to be rowing that stick. Especially going up and down hills, that could be a little bit uncomfortable. Now, if you know how to drive a manual transmission, and you're really an expert at it, they do excellent off-road. I used to do it myself. And there are certain situations, and I will say rare situations, where a manual may have an advantage over an automatic. And one of them is being stuck in snow or mud, where you can work the clutch and rock the vehicle. So by pushing the clutch in and out, you can apply torque to the axles and then let off. Apply and then let off. And that can help you rock yourself out of a situation. Now with an automatic, you really can't do that, because you'd have to throw it from reverse into drive, and it's not going to work. It's not going to be as effective as a manual transmission would be. Another situation, guys tell me, where the manual outperforms the automatic is if you are going up a really steep hill. Then the front end gets light. You can push that clutch in and release all power to the rear axle. With an automatic, you got to throw it in neutral, and it just doesn't happen as fast. So yeah, maybe in those extreme situations, the manual is going to have an advantage over the automatic. But if you look at the rest of the time, on the highway, general off-roading, your wife is going to drive it. A valet is going to drive it. The automatics have simply come to a level where manuals are almost obsolete. Now, I agree with Jay Leno that it really is nice to see manufacturers offer full manual transmissions with a clutch. Because if you look at the modern world, especially in the high-performance muscle cars and exotics, the dual clutch automatics are pretty much taken over. Even on the track, the automatics are performing well. Having the ability to shift the transmission in microseconds, lightning fast, up and down, is just unrivaled. However, a lot of guys still want that old manual transmission driving experience where you have a clutch. And I will say I enjoy it for about 20 minutes, and then I get tired of it and wish I had an automatic. Another thing the automatics have added over the last decade or so is manual mode, or tap shift, whatever you want to call it, bump shift. So essentially you can control the transmission in all the forward gears with a shifter. Whether it's a toggle switch, a rocker switch, a bump shifter. I got an ice cream truck in Australia with buttons on the floor. You can control the shifting of the transmission electronically. This mimics the manual transmission control of being in whatever gear you want. There is no clutch. However, some transmissions like the 6L80 and other sophisticated modern transmissions have dual clutches. And that basically means the transmission's in 2 gears at the same time. And what determines what gear you're in is essentially the electronics locking up that clutch pad. And the beauty of that is you can have a transmission that shifts any way you want. You can electronically program that transmission to shift like a quarter-mile car where it bangs into gear, or you could put that same transmission in your grandma's Cadillac, and it's all software and programming that controls that transmission. I can say over the last decade doing these LS-JK swaps, the 6L80 has proven itself to be an excellent transmission. The transmission can handle a lot of torque. It's proven itself behind supercharged engines, 40s, and all the other stuff you guys put in your JKs. If you look at the gearing on the 6L80, having a 4-to-1 low and a 0.66 overdrive, that's phenomenal. And if you did want to put a 600 horsepower engine in your Jeep, GM did offer the 6L90, and that transmission can handle massive torque. So what we have with an automatic transmission is a transmission that can shift automatically or manually, a transmission that has more diverse gearing than most of the manuals, a transmission that has a lot of strength, and I can't overemphasize that. Let's talk a second about this vehicle. This vehicle has a 6.4 Hemi in it with a Getrick 6-speed, and it had some issues. The lady that owns it's a really nice lady, and like I said, She wanted us to do a swap many years ago with a manual transmission, and we just didn't have anything available for her. We're going to talk about the options here in a minute that we have now. She had a 6.4 Hemi put in. She's had a lot of issues like a lot of customers. Some of the issues have to do with the manual transmission Hemi. Other issues have to do with just the build. So the issues that she's had putting the manual transmission in is her cruise control intermittently cuts out, her temperature gauge stops working, and you can see that here. We got a ETC light on, check engine light on, and you can see that our cooling temp gauge isn't working. Now, it actually is working, but there's a communication problem somewhere. From what I understand, the manual transmission Hemi JKs have some funny stuff going on. You probably saw this Jeep in an early video where we fitted our fan controller, and it is running the Motec fully proportional fan controller, and the customer really likes it because the fan doesn't run all the time. It runs based on AC pressure and coolant temperature, automatic transmission cooler, so it doesn't run off of that, but it could if you put an input in. So this is what happens is over time, something in the can gets corrupt and it freaks all this stuff out. Now we tried to use the AEV ProCal to activate the Pentastar fan, but it won't work. And it has to do with the PCM transmitting the proper data to the TIPM. We did check the TIPM and it is putting out the 10 Hertz that the Pentastar uses, but the PCM will not transmit that signal. Hey guys, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is a Hemi and this is just a configuration that has issues. Not that the LSs are free of manual transmission issues. We'll talk about that. I always talk about how important it is to set up the suspension for the vehicle. Well, this vehicle was not set up right. The drive shafts were too short. They weren't resized. That set up a vibration that caused the transfer case to break. She put a new transfer case in, but the drive shafts remained the same length. So of course we're resizing the drive shafts. The suspension was pretty wonky in this vehicle. This is a Hemi, and it was lifted up 4 to 6 inches. I don't remember, and it's a two-door, so it's short coupled. Hemis tend to put the weight up higher and more forward than the LSs. In fact, the LSs sit pretty low and back, so the vehicle dynamics are very, very similar to the stock 3.8 or 3.6 engine. But with the Hemi having that weight more forward and higher, it does tend to lead to more roly-poly. So if your vehicle isn't stable in roll, you don't have good sway bars on it, it can get a little bit hairy. In fact, one of the reasons this vehicle is here is it was all roly-poly. She was driving in a storm and she laid it on its side. And here's a couple of pictures of that. We don't really like doing anything but engine conversions, but because of the history I had with this lady, I told her I'd help her out. We put a completely new suspension system on it. We went with a Metal Cloak Game Changer, 3.5-inch springs in the front, 2.5 in the rear. We want to keep it as low as possible. We had to go to that extra inch in the front because of the weight of the Hemi. And I really like the way this Jeep sits now. You'll notice it has a slight rake with the front end being slightly down. I don't like that look where the front end's higher than the rear. Also, we lowered the Jeep a bit, which obviously lowers the center of gravity. So it's less likely that she will roll this Jeep again. So I'm not going to talk too much about the Hemi manual transmission issues because I'm not an expert on that. I've worked on them, but I know that there are some challenges that they have. On the LS LT side, what you have to know is GM did not support manual transmissions in most of their LS engines or LT engines. If you look at the 5.3, 6.0, 6.2 truck motors, they're all automatics. GM didn't offer them with manual transmissions. And when you put a manual transmission behind an automatic operating system, things can get a little bit funny. Now, GM did offer manual transmissions in the LS engines. The LS3 was offered with a manual transmission, and from what I understand, some of the exports to Mexico, like the 4.8s, came with manual transmissions. But you don't really have to go there. You don't have to run those operating systems. I know that some of the other wiring companies out there will run a Corvette tune on everything they sell, and they'll say it's a base tune, and then tweak it to match the application. We don't really buy that. We think that you should run the tune that is designed for your engine. And there are literally thousands of parameters and coefficients. Remember, these are coefficient-based operating systems. These aren't lookup tables for fuel and spark strategy. So it takes in dozens and dozens of parameters at the same time and multiplies them on the fly to come up with proper fuel and spark delivery. So there's just so many coefficients that are not going to work properly if you take a 6.2 Corvette tune and try to put it in your 5.3. If you're doing an LS manual transmission, it's not a big deal. Essentially what you're going to do is bypass the CAN in the TCM, and that doesn't matter if it's an old T42 or a T43 6L80. You just literally bypass the CAN network where it goes through the TCM, then the ECM will communicate. Of course, you're going to remove the transmission codes from the ECM. Not a big deal. The biggest problem is getting vehicle speed. As I've discussed before, the Gen 4 LS engine controllers are just that, engine controllers, and they get their vehicle speed from the transmission control module. So if you remove the transmission, you don't have an actual vehicle speed sent to the ECM, and you say, well, that's not a big deal because I'm driving a manual, and it really isn't. However, there is one mode that the ECM uses vehicle speed for, and that is idle mode. That does kind of matter, because when you come to a stop, let's say when you go below 1 mile an hour, the ECM kicks itself into an idle mode, and that makes the idle more stable. It changes the parameters. It knows that you're not rolling and you're not in a follower mode, so it makes the idle more stable. Now, that's pretty easily overcome by changing a few parameters like minimum idle airflow, and obviously just bump the idle speed up because you got a manual transmission and a clutch. And we've done many manual transmissions. So those are really the main issues that we have with a manual transmission LS swap. Now, if you want to run a full manual transmission operating system out of an LS3, you can do that, and it works just fine. But to get the functionality we want with variable valve timing, active fuel management, and all the other functions that the engine is designed for, we tend to stick with the original operating system and then do the mods. So what transmissions will work in a Gen 4 LS? We've done many builds with the NSG 370, which is the stock Jeep 6-speed. The stock Jeep 6-speed is good for about 300 horsepower in my opinion. So it will not work in a 6.2, 6.0, you got 40s with 1 tons. It will work with a 5.3 and relatively small tires. We've done many of them and they hold up just fine. Now, if you're going to go out and drive it like a gorilla and do burnouts, you're going to break that transmission. But you could even break that transmission with a 3.8 if you tried. So that is the most cost-effective swap. You get a 5.3 LS. You need to go to Novak Adapters and get their LS to NSG 370 adapter. That will mate the NSG 370 to your LS engine. You can use the JK master cylinder to power the GM slave cylinder. Now, the NSG 370 will not bolt up directly to Novak's adapter because it has the small 3.8 Caravan minivan bell housing. But the TJ did run the 4-liter engine with a large flywheel. So you got a couple of choices. You can buy a large case from Chrysler and put your JK guts into it, or you can buy a TJ transmission. In order to get cruise control in the manual transmission automatic swap, meaning when you're running a manual transmission within an automatic operating system, we have to add a cruise module. This cruise module plugs directly into a remote can and then activates the controls on your steering wheel. So as far as you're concerned, everything remains the same. The cruise light in the dash still works, resume, accelerate, cancel, on, off. It all works exactly the same way as it did stock, right through the original switchgear. Now, if you want more horsepower, we've run the MVG 4500s. Advanced Adapter supports that with the LS engines. Call Steve Roberts over there and he'll set you up. The MVG 4500, remember, is a truck transmission. So it has somewhat of a granny low, and it shifts like a truck transmission. Don't expect it to shift like an LS3 Tremec. It's not going to. If you want to do expedition, it's an excellent transmission. But I've had guys build 500 horse LS3s with the MVG 4500, and it doesn't work that well. It doesn't shift that fast. Your 0 to 60 times are compromised because of that granny first gear. But it is a good transmission if you're looking for expedition. There's the miscellaneous transmissions, I'm going to call them, like the AX15 and others that guys have put in, but they're really not mainstream. So we're going to move up to the transmission we've used several times, and I think is the best transmission for a manual. There's only one downside to it, and that's the cost. The Tremec 6060 is an excellent transmission. It came in the Camaros, came in the high-performance 6.2 vehicles. It has a short shift. It's extremely strong. It has pretty good gear spacing if you gear your JK right. I've heard some guys complain that the gear spacing is not ideal, but if you gear your JK right, it works just fine. Now, the transmission we've used is the 6060 from Rockland Gear, where George over there makes a 4-wheel drive adapter and a custom output shaft. In the early days, he was using an adapter that was quite long, which required us to section the middle cross member. But from what George tells me now, he's shortened it up about 4 inches, which means essentially it should bolt in. So that's going to wrap it up for this manual transmission video. If you absolutely have to have a manual transmission, give us a call. We'll go through the options with you. So we're going to hit the mountain with this 2-door Hemi, and we'll talk to you later.